This episode of Literary Treks is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek.fm at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/Trek.fm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek.fm.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading, in case I got bored.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Literary Treks, your dedicated Star Trek books and comics show here on Trek.fm. I'm just one of your hosts, Dan Gunther, and joining me, as he does every week, is the resplendent Bruce Gibson. Bruce, how are you this week?
I am doing great, just being a reading fool. I'm just constantly reading Star Trek books. It's crazy, but I love it. I mean, I don't think I'll ever get tired of it, which is why I'm on the show, I think.
That's really good news, because I don't think we'll ever run out of Star Trek books. Later on in the feature, we're actually going to be joined by Justin Oser, who has made it his mission in life to read every single Star Trek novel, which, I mean, is kind of a mission I have in my life, not really an active one, but, you know, would be a really cool achievement unlocked. But there are tons of Star Trek novels, and I would kind of be okay if we never, ever ran out of them, personally.
I know, I agree. Well, and my goal when I started reading Star Trek novels in like 1990 was to read every novel, and that list was a lot shorter then. I think there was, I don't know, 60. This is when the numbered series, there was like 60 TOS and there was like only 12 TNG at the time. And that was like it. And I was like, oh, I'm going to read them all. But that was that time then too. All of a sudden there was like 2 novels every month, you know, because, you know, then you have Deep Space Nine that premiered and it was just like, and then my life, you know, sometimes life gets busy and I just didn't keep up. And now it's like, there's hundreds of these and there's just no way I'm going to get them all read. But what's really cool is the feature today, that book I read while Matt Rushing was visiting me over the weekend. And it was pretty cool that we were both reading the book at the same time. We could comment to each other about things. So that was pretty fun.
That's really neat. Very cool. And to add to this ever lengthening line of Star Trek novels with no end in sight, fingers crossed, we actually have some information on one of the new novels coming out at the end of November this year. And that is the briefly released cover for Titan, Fortune of War. Now, I say briefly because this cover came out just the other day. There was a feature on StarTrek.com, but that feature has since disappeared. And I think that's because, and I hate to say this, but they have the wrong ship on the cover. This is not the Titan. What's going on here?
Well, I didn't even think anything was wrong with it. I knew it wasn't the Titan, but I just figured it must be a ship that's going to be featured as a prominent ship within this Titan novel, but I guess not.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking initially, but according to David Mack's comments on Facebook, apparently they are going to fix it, and it's going to be fixed before it goes to the printers. So it turns out that this was actually a mistake. It was supposed to be the Titan on the cover and not this Akira class ship, which I'm actually kind of sad about because it's a gorgeous cover. I really like the Akira, and you know, I'm kind of sad this wasn't just a support chip that was going to be in this novel or something.
I know. I really like the cover too. And now, of course, as of this recording, this is, I guess they're going to make changes to this cover, but maybe by the time people hear this episode, the new one's out already. So just if you see a cover of Star Trek Titan and you see the Titan, then you've got the right cover. If you see a different ship, then you're seeing the wrong cover.
Right, absolutely. Well, they also did release the back cover blurb for this one, and this one sounds really interesting. If you remember, we had David Mack on one of the times he was on earlier. He talked a little bit about this, saying that it had some tie to TNG Season 3, and here we are. We know what that is now. So here's the back cover blurb. Death slumbers in the ashes of silent planets, waiting to be awakened and unleashed. 20 years have passed since the interstellar scourge known as the Husnock were exterminated without warning by a being with godlike abilities. Left behind, intact but abandoned, their desolate worlds and derelict ships brim with destructive potential. Now a discovery by Federation Cultural Research Team has drawn the attention of several ruthless factions. From black market smugglers to alien military forces, it seems every belligerent power in the quadrant hopes to capture the Husnock's lethal technology. All that stands between the galaxy and those who have come to plunder the cruelest secrets of the Husnock are Admiral William Riker, Captain Christine Vale, and the crew of the Starship Titan. So pretty cool, taking off from the TNG Season 3 episode, The Survivors, with the Dowd, the Kevin Uxbridge, who destroyed all of the Husnock, and we get kind of a follow-up to that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's coming out November 28th, and I think we're getting 2 books that date.
We are, yeah. So with all of the weird changes in the book schedule that have happened over the last year, mostly with, as far as I know, 2 big things have affected that, and that's the moving date of Star Trek Discovery, which means that David Mack's Discovery novel has been moved a couple of times in the schedule. And also Kirsten Byers' book Architects of Infinity has been moved around a little bit, and that's kind of affected the schedule. So we have 2 books coming out at the end of September, a Deep Space Nine book and the Discovery book. And then also at the end of November, we get this Titan novel, Fortune of War. And I believe it's the English translation of the Prometheus novel, Fire with Fire, that's coming out that day as well.
Yeah, the novel that originally came out in Germany, in German, of course.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But we're not going to get the German version unless you want to. You can get the German version now, but yeah, the English version's coming out in November.
Yeah, exactly. So, man, we've had a couple months that there's no Star Trek novel, but we're getting it made up for at the end of the year here. We're going to get lots of Star Trek novels at once. So, Bruce and I are going to be hurriedly reading them into the wee hours just for you.
Yes, only for you, not for us.
Awesome. Well, that's all that we have really for the news this week. So what do you say we jump right into the feature and welcome our special guest?
I'm ready to go on this Enterprise.
Well, today we're talking about a new book release, which is something we haven't had in a little while. So it's exciting. We finally get the chance to sit around and talk about a new Star Trek novel. And this week it's Star Trek Enterprise, Rise of the Federation, Patterns of Interference by Christopher L. Bennett. Now, when this guy writes a book, it's like the titles get longer and longer every time. Am I right? There's just colons everywhere. And man, I think this might set a record for longest title. Although Department of Temporal Investigations probably has that title still.
Yeah, it is definitely a long title. Lots of colons. It's like a colonoscopy of titles. Does that was my little joke. I'm done. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You can tip me at the bar.
He's here all week. Try the veal. It's great. Well, joining us also today to talk about Patterns of Interference is special guest Justin Oser. Justin, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here. I'm really excited because Literary Treks was the first Trek.fm podcast that I discovered about a year and a half ago. So it's just really exciting to actually be here talking about a book.
Well, I'm glad we were able to rope you in and really pull your teeth to try to join us for the show.
Yeah, I think I probably have asked Bruce about 20 times to be on Literary Treks, and finally a success.
So there you go, everyone. If you want to be on Literary Treks, you have to ask at least 20 times.
Yep. Make sure to tweet at Bruce. Tweet at Bruce. He'll get you on the show. Don't tweet at me. I'm just kidding. No, it's awesome to have you on for sure. You know, one of our associate producers, of course, and finally sharing the airwaves with us here on Literary Treks. Airwaves. I think I might be 60 or something. I'll try and sound a little younger today. But
you're not an associate producer still, are you?
I am still an associate producer of Earl Grey, as well as a co-host of Earl Grey.
Awesome. Well, we thank you for your support of the network.
Oh, you're on Earl Grey? Is that you I hear on? Because you're recent. I know. I'm just kidding around. But yeah, you recently started on Earl Grey.
I did. About a month ago, I joined Earl Grey with Amy Nelson and Richard Marquez because Lee Hutchison had some things going on, needed to step back. But yeah, we've been doing the show for about a month, been having a good time talking Next Generation every week.
Well, it's great to have a Next Generation expert on here to talk about Enterprise.
Well, I love Enterprise too, so don't worry, it won't lose me. But
okay, good.
But yeah, the interesting thing is some Next Generation stuff that I was thinking about while reading this book.
I was going to say there are some links that we will definitely get to in our discussion, kind of surprising, very overt Next Generation references almost, but we'll get there for sure. So yeah, like I said, we're going back to the Rise of the Federation series. I think this is Christopher Bennett's 5th book in this series. First of all, just to start out with, Justin, you specifically, what do you think of the Rise of the Federation series? Have you read all of the books to this point? And, you know, how are you enjoying it?
Yeah, I've read all of the Rise of the Federation books. I've actually read all of the relaunch books, the Romulan War ones, and the ones before that, including The Last Full Measure, which is kind of only a partial relaunch book. But yeah, so I've read those. I've really enjoyed the Rise of the Federation. I mean, I think each of them is very different in their own thing, and probably my favorites are A Choice of Futures and Uncertain Logic. But they're all really great, getting this insight into a part of the Federation's history that we don't really know very much about the early years. In this book, it's 2165 and 66, so within the first 5 years of the Federation. And in going through it in these 5 books, it's been great, all the insights, and Christopher L. Bennett just puts in so much that's going on, and usually there's a lot of intricate plots. I felt like this one, it was fewer different plot lines. For some of the books, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, but it was definitely focused on a couple of them. But I've enjoyed, all the Rise of the Federation books a lot.
Excellent. Well, yeah, like I say, we've got an interesting story in this one, and that's, to me, always been a really untapped resource in storytelling, is these early days of the Federation. And I've got to say, I'm really enjoying Christopher Bennett's tackling of these few years here. So, we've got a lot of continuation of some stories that have been set up in previous books, some new things going on with a lot of these antagonists that we've seen. And first of all, the first thing I wanted to talk about is kind of the big baddie of the book, the Saurian dictator, Maltuvis, which this is an interesting character to me. It was a throwaway line in the episode, What Are Little Girls Made Of?, where Kirk kind of rattles off a list of dictators from history, and Maltuvis is one of them. And there's been some different comics and stuff that have taken that character and done different things, but I like Christopher L. Bennett's taking that character, making him a Saurian, and clearly, even after this book, I think there's still going to be more going forward with this character, but in this book, we really see his rise to power. He gained power in the previous book, but now he's really kind of solidifying and cementing that power. I was kind of wondering what you guys thought of this character and how he's depicted in this book.
Well, my first impression was the Saurians. I mean, it reminded me a little bit of North Korea when I first started reading it. And then it shifted a little, maybe just briefly, to Russia and then to the United States. And it stuck in the United States for a while. I felt like it was his commentary on really any prominent world leader that is narcissistic, or his opinion may be they are narcissistic. And so I felt there were, and not even just on this subject, but I felt like there was a lot of subjects where Christopher Bennett was making a lot of his opinions known about the political climate of our country in the United States and other countries in the world, which, of course, there's always things like that going on throughout world history. But I really felt like he was using the opportunity now to really dive into that a little deeper than he has in previous books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely made the same connection, Bruce. I felt like, in some of the things he was talking about, specifically about dictatorships, but in other places, even though what Maltuvis is doing and his methods are more extreme, he was definitely making some commentary on current U.S. politics. That definitely kind of came up in my head, at least a few times during the course of this book.
Yeah, there's definitely some ties there for sure. I think a lot of what we're seeing in Maltuvis and his rise to power is, a very familiar story that's played out a lot of times throughout history. I mean, Hitler, for example, that initial consolidation of power, marginalization and delegitimization of the press and that sort of thing. Really, it's a story that's been told over and over and over again. And North Korea, I think, Bruce, is a perfect example. Generation after generation of this populace that's shielded from outside influence, outside information, and told only, what the leader wants them to know, and basically told what to believe and how to believe it. Famously, the Nazi regime repeating the big lie enough times until it becomes a truth, And another parallel that I noticed that I thought was really interesting was Syria to me. For example, later on we get the Federation deciding to intervene in a limited way in Syrian politics and what's going on there, not by sending troops or something like that, but advisors to help the resistance. That really reminded me a lot of the kind of small-scale interventions in Syria with advisors being sent to help the rebels there, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I hadn't thought of Syria, actually, when they talked about sending in advisors. I mean, I think that may be something that typically happens as a prelude to greater intervention, but I actually thought first about Vietnam, because I think, fairly famously, there were military advisors that were sent in a little bit in the late 50s and early 60s, and then it was kind of slowly escalated to more of like a full military presence. But the intervention that they're talking about, it very much makes you think of our own world. And if you think of, instead of intervening in another planet, intervening in another country, and there are definitely those kinds of debates, whether it makes sense to intervene in certain situations or not. Is it case by case? Should we never do that? Should we always in certain situations? So I found that really interesting, considering, current debates and debates that have happened for as long as, countries have been able to be more connected in the world.
Well, I've been living a lot of Star Wars when I was reading this book, because the Star Wars people put me on panels at DragonCon. So I was reading this book throughout DragonCon. So constantly talking about Star Wars over that weekend and reading this book at the same time, I started to see the parallels between the two franchises, because so Maltuvis reminded me of the Emperor in Star Wars, and the suppression that they're doing to other worlds, and how they're playing them. And there's all these rebels that are coming, and all these different factions that are trying to take down the leader, and there's distortion in information and news of what's really going on in the galaxy, and who's on what side, and who believes in the Empire and who doesn't. So there was a lot of this book that I thought, you can just change a lot of these names and say, hey, this is Star Wars, and this is the Emperor, and this is Darth Vader, and these are the rebels, and so on and so forth. So that was kind of really weird when you're talking Star Wars all weekend at a DragonCon, and then come to this book, and I had to remind myself, oh wait, I'm reading Star Trek right now, but it's almost felt like Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of those can be pretty universal themes as well. Freedom and suppression, and if people want to resist, having a rebellion or resistance. And yeah, I mean, I think it's something that's been an important topic for a long time across a lot of different societies.
And it's something that is going to have resonance, I think. A lot of people think of something like the rise of the Nazis and Hitler in the 30s as something that could, never happen again kind of thing. But, in this book, we've got a modern society that's on the cusp of being a spacefaring, interstellar race. And all it takes is the right circumstances and the right person to capitalize on that. And, it can very easily happen. And I think, that's a good message to be sending because, what does Picard say in the Drumhead? Constant vigilance is what is needed to protect against people like that. Speaking of TNG, Earl Grey, there we go. It's a tie.
Yeah, well, I mean, in fact, when I opened this book, there were 2 quotes from Picard at the very beginning, and I was like, am I reading the right book? Or is this a 24th century book? Because I don't know if in like the other Enterprise books that there's been something at the very beginning that hasn't... Because usually for a lot of these books, there's a historian's note where it's like, this takes place between this time and this time. It was more like, here's a Picard quote, here's the beginning of the book. And I was kind of jarred by that. I was like, whoa, okay.
So wait, you pick up an Enterprise book, you start reading Picard. Wait, is this the Next Generation? Or is this, these are the voyages? The last episode of Enterprise.
Oh, so you're saying this novel might be inside a holodeck program?
It could be. And then Riker and Troy show up.
Well,
I have that on my mind because I just watched it this morning.
Well, at least if not that, it almost does feel like an historical accounting of, maybe something somebody would study as to where the Prime Directive came from. And I think those Picard quotes really started off on the right note. It gets the reader thinking about these things. And that's kind of what this book becomes, is kind of the ultimate Prime Directive debate. Like, it was right there at the beginning, So what is the Federation's role in not just pre-warp civilizations? Because a lot of people think the Prime Directive applies only to pre-warp civilizations, but there are different facets to it, right? So pre-warp civilizations don't contact them. That's a given, according to the Prime Directive. But even civilizations that have warp drive, it's up to them to determine their course. And if they don't want the Federation to be there, the Federation will say, okay, we won't be there. The Prime Directive says we have to honor your wishes. And it's kind of interesting to see on this basic level, people in a room sitting around debating this at the very beginning.
Yeah, for me, that was one of the most fascinating aspects of the book, this kind of argument that was going on at different parts throughout the book, all the way toward the end. Just to see this, not in a period of time where it's already been settled, this is Starfleet Order number 1, and this is what we do, but talking about different ways of doing it and different ways of interpreting it was very, very interesting for me, and to see people on different sides of it, and also just to reflect on those, because I thought that I had a good idea of the Prime Directive and why it's a good thing generally, but there were some really good arguments that were made here for something a little more nuanced or something a little different that really got me to think about it in a way I hadn't before.
I remember Shran was the opposite end of the argument from Archer. Archer's pushing non-interference, and Shran is like, no, that's just, holding us back, and we can help other races, which is kind of interesting for me, because when I think of Shran, I think of him being more the type that would say, well, let them fend for themselves. Let them do, we have to take care of ourselves first. But instead, he seemed to have more compassion for other races than Archer did. And I'm not saying that Archer doesn't have compassion, but I think, if anything, maybe Archer has a better understanding that getting involved, that the United Federation of Planets getting involved with these other planets before they're ready really could do more harm than good. Where Shran's thinking, well, maybe, but you have to take a chance, and you could do more good than maybe harm. So there's two sides of the coins between the two. So I liked how pitting these two characters against each other, while at the same time showing that they really have a tight bond as friends.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, it's also very interesting to see Archer and Soval on the same side of an argument.
Yes.
Which was very odd.
Yeah, all these years later, he's come around to the Vulcan point of view of non-interference. It's quite interesting to see.
Which might be the only reason Tran's against it too. No, I'm just kidding.
Maybe, but like in the course of these arguments, I mean, Tran was actually making some good arguments. At one point, he says, "Okay, let's say we have this non-interference directive, and we explain why this has happened. Maybe your first generation of officers will understand that, but over time," and he says the next generation of officers, giving a little wink there, would not understand, all those years later. And then Archer says, no one would be as twisted as to think it would make sense to let a whole species die in order to avoid harming them. And of course, you think of sometimes in the next generation when Picard was willing to do exactly that. So just seeing like those different points of view, it made me a little more uncertain where I would stand on this.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was really interesting that they threw in that Archer saying, "Oh, come on, Tran, no one would ever take it to that extreme," but if it's not spelled out in the rules that way, it's very clear that someone would take it to that extreme. And like you say, in the next generation, we get examples of that happening. Picard saying in the season 7 episode Homeward that, the Barallans, their fate is for their world to be destroyed and them to all die, and they can't interfere because of the Prime Directive. Well, clearly, even the people who are framing the Prime Directive and who are fully behind it, that wasn't their intention, which I actually found really interesting and kind of a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, definitely, because I think what the idea that we're getting here is that there's a certain spirit behind it. Like, we're going to try not to interfere because we don't want to cause more harm than good. But if there's a situation where it's clear that we'll do more good, like the whole species will get wiped out, like why would you let the whole species get wiped out if you could help them out? How could it do them more harm to try to help their species survive than to watch them all die? So that was really fascinating because I hadn't thought about that kind of argument going on. And it makes sense. Like, oh, maybe we should make an exception if they're all going to die,
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny that Archer seems to think that goes without saying. And
he's like, oh, everybody 200 years from now will understand that, right?
Exactly, yeah. No, and it's... to me, what really the takeaway from that was, this is something that future generations, of course, will think is sacrosanct and almost, what's the word I'm looking for? Like inviolable and holy and sacred. Yeah. But they're people. Everyone that deals with this, everyone that formed this rule, everyone that will follow it in years to come are all people. And it's up to the people involved to interpret it and utilize it as they should. It's not, nothing should be so absolute as like that Picard quote says at the beginning, there can be no justice as long as laws are absolute, It's something definitely that I think it's clear from this, the framers of the Prime Directive thought about, and later generations definitely should too.
And it gets to an interesting place because there's a parallel, in the United States, because there are these arguments over what our Constitution means and what the amendments to the Constitution mean and how to interpret it, what was the intention, and should we go literally by what it says. And I mean, these things really, it's not just in the Star Trek universe, but these things really matter because when someone puts down a law or, something's written down, it can definitely change in how people think about it over time.
What I've learned in my career is how contracts are very specific, but still yet they can be interpreted in different ways. And it's funny when you have attorneys from two different parties working on a contract and then they come to an agreement that the language is clear and makes sense. But then a few years later, different attorneys look at it and say, well, it reads to me this way. And the other says, yeah, but I read it this way. And what was the intent? And it's like, it's the same thing. It's like, you can be so precise in your rules and your regulations, and there's still an element of what is the perception or what was the goal of the rule. And can always be argued. And so it's really hard to have an absolute.
And even language can change over time. I mean, the way we use language now as opposed to 100 or 200 years ago, or what certain words mean, can change. So how do you effectively convey what you want to say to future generations? It's a very difficult thing to think about.
That's a very good point, especially, the U.S. Constitution has been brought up. And I mean, that's a document that was written over 2 centuries ago by people in a very different culture than what we're living in now. And, it's interesting to think about that. It almost seems as though the Enterprise D should have a legal section that, they stop at a planet and Picard has to go consult the room full of high-priced lawyers to figure out exactly what he should be doing.
Or maybe instead of a counselor, there's a lawyer on the bridge that tries to interpret what he should be doing.
There you go.
But yeah, language can be tricky, because I was wearing a sleeveless shirt the other day because I thought I had the right to bear arms. And obviously that's not what that means, right? Dan, why are you rolling your eyes?
Oh, I think they just about rolled out of my head. I'm actually acknowledging that was a very good joke. Nicely done.
Oh, okay, well, there you go.
Excellent. Well, we get another example in this book of Starfleet and the Federation dealing with a new world. And, a lot of these ideas behind the Prime Directive and what we're talking about here kind of interweave and seem to have parallels in the story of Captain T'Pol and her crew aboard the Endeavour, along with Hoshi Sato, encountering this new world. It's been discovered and charted by space boomers. So, like Travis Mayweather's ilk, but, explorers, and looking to exploit resources on a new world. But they've called Starfleet in because there's this strange race of tree-like beings. This entire planet is populated only by plant life, but we get trees that can move through their roots and tentacles across the surface of the planet, and they're not certain if they're sentient or even sapient, or, if they're on some sort of level that requires protection and they can't just be chopped down and used up for resources. So this was an interesting story and kind of just parallels the Prime Directive story just a little bit, because they're not even certain if this planet has sentient life and whether that life should be protected or not. What did you guys think of this aspect of the story?
I love this part of the story because it was an exotic new form of life. And one thing that made the story a little bit different is, there are all these debates about the Prime Directive, but what's going to happen eventually. They're going to adopt the Prime Directive. It's just a matter of getting there. And even the story with Maltuvis, like he has these aspirations to, conquer a lot of worlds and do something to the Federation, but it's probably not going to succeed like he wants to. But this plot with this plant life that can move and seems to have all of this complex behavior, I didn't really know where it was going or what it would mean for the future or what they would discover. So I actually found it really exciting. And there were times where I wanted to see more of that than the other part of the story that was about the Prime Directive and about Maltuvis and Section 31 and all of this stuff. So I always love it when there's a new form of life that's different. And, I probably haven't read quite as many novels as you guys have, but it seemed like, a unique form of life in the Star Trek universe, unless there's something I haven't read about.
Yeah, trees walking around remind me of Lord of the Rings. It almost made me wonder if the author was trying to make HR Puffin stuff. I don't know if you remember this show from the 70s, but they had moving trees and plants and things like that. But it is kind of like this weird world feeling, which you would not have gotten on the TV show. Possibly with Enterprise, they could have done it with some CGI or whatever, but I really like it when the novels delve into something that's very unique and off-worldly from our own. And and I remember them saying that the land was spongy, and when they went to land the shuttlecraft or the ship or whatever, the sponges kind of parted way. So it's like things were alive, but a lot that was also a discussion there too of like, what do you constitute as something being alive and intelligent? Do they have feelings? Do they feel pain? All these things that come up. That even recently I've been hearing something about plants can actually feel. And there's a debate right now going on about that I just recently heard in the news. So, it brought up a lot of those thinkings too. I also felt that the storyline didn't quite fit in with the rest of the book, but it does fit in if you look at from the standpoint of defining the Prime Directive, which this book, I don't feel like that was the focus of the book, but that was a piece of it. So I guess it does fit in, but for a while I kept thinking like, well, how's this fit in with the rest of the story? But I think it just was more of a statement about the Prime Directive.
Yeah, I did wonder that, like, how's this going to fit in? And in a way, I'm glad it didn't, because it probably would have been pretty contrived if they would have tried to fit it in as maybe the saving thing against Maltuvis or something like that. But it was really interesting. I think, yeah, it does make you think about the Prime Directive, because if these are sentient beings, then it's a pre-warp civilization, and should they be in contact with this civilization? But they didn't know that when they got there, but it brings up those interesting questions. But also, I mean, I think when Christopher L. Bennett puts something in a book, he does something with it at a later time or comes back to it. So I feel like he'll come back to it, or it'll become an important element. But I'm glad, even though for the most part it seemed kind of unrelated, that he put it in there, because it was really fascinating. All of this behavior that they had that was really complex, and even like funerary rites and things like that was just amazing. I was like, oh my goodness, I want to read like a whole book about this, because this is something very different that I haven't read about before in Star Trek.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the strange new world aspect is definitely very alluring. The other aspect of the story that kind of struck me was thinking about the Prime Directive and going forward and that sort of thing. We know that, Starfleet will abide by these rules and but what about boomers? What about capitalists heading out there? What about people looking to make their fortune and make their name and that kind of thing? Some of the attitudes espoused by the boomers, it doesn't really seem like they're going to worry too much about setting down on some planet that has a pre-warp civilization, so that like one character says, so that they can mine their sacred mountain for the minerals they need to fix their warp drive.
Oh my goodness. And yeah, go ahead.
No, that was fascinating to me too, because the boomers really aren't controlled necessarily by the Federation, and especially not by Starfleet, and yet the Prime Directive doesn't apply to them, and they don't necessarily feel like they have to follow it, and this is their livelihood. And if you're preventing them from going to planets and doing whatever they need to do to conduct their business, then they're out of a job. And so this has a big impact on other people outside of the Federation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but these boomers that are part of the Earth Cargo Service, wouldn't they be Federation citizens? And in some way, wouldn't the Prime Directive apply to them?
I guess, but at the same time, I think about boomers that I do think that they're probably citizens of the Federation, but do they need to be? I mean, I guess what I'm saying is they could split themselves off and say, well, we're not. We're no longer part of the Federation. We're our own entity of society of whatever. I mean, they can claim themselves of another planet, or I don't know.
But who do they, I don't know if it's been really established, but who do they report to? Like the Earth Cargo Service, like who has jurisdiction over that?
That's a really good question, especially now that it's the Federation, what kind of rules of operation are in place there. Yeah. I think it's also interesting. We're kind of on the cusp of what we see in the original series, where it is kind of the Wild West of space. And, someone like R.M. Merrick can go out there and, sacrifice his whole crew and establish himself as part of the culture on the planet of Romans. It might be 5 years before a starship wanders by and says, hey, what's going on here? I wonder if maybe one of these captains could set himself up as a god on some planet, and, Starfleet doesn't have unlimited resources. They maybe come by a decade later and go, what's going on here?
Yeah, that is a really good point. And, for me, since I'm thinking a lot about the next generation era, like when I read a book in the Enterprise era, I have to be like, oh yeah, they have money. They're talking about earning paychecks and all of that. So it's kind of a different consideration than you see in the next generation era. And what it means is that, like, some of these attitudes, like some of the way these boomers talked about it, I was just really just disgusted by how they were talking about it. Like, we're just gonna have these people worship us as gods. We're gonna mine their sacred mountain. We're gonna take advantage of their women. I was like, oh my goodness, these guys are terrible. And they're just kind of out there, and it seems like there's not much that the Federation can do about it. But I found that kind of thread through it about boomers really fascinating, and it'd be interesting to see kind of how that moves through time, because there was this idea in the Enterprise show itself that there are faster warp drives, and eventually what they're doing won't be needed. And I wonder if we're gonna kind of get toward that, or it's something different. I don't know. I just feel like that's a thread that'll be picked up later.
I also feel like these people who are in this job now, they're the future version of them in 100 years are going to be the Harry Mudds, the guys out there kind of causing trouble and being a thorn in starship captains' sides and stuff. So it almost feels like there's just a little bit of setup of connective tissue there. I may be reading too much into it, but like there was definitely, and by design, that feeling of the old West and the open frontier in the original series. And it kind of feels like once, faster warp drives start kind of getting around to the general population, maybe, boomers and other civilians who aren't Starfleet, we might see this kind of unregulated stuff going on.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Maybe this is the start of that kind of thing that you'll see, in the original series. Hadn't thought about that.
It'd be interesting in Discovery if Harry Mudd refers to himself, or someone refers to him as a boomer, or the child of boomers, or something like that.
From a long line of boomers, or something like that. Yeah, that's
an interesting reference. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, another aspect of this book, and we talked a little bit about it, is kind of the twin themes, I guess you could say, of freedom and truth. These are two ideas that come up a lot in this story. So you've got, Trip and the Orion woman whose alias is I only remember. What's her real name, sorry?
I think it's Devna.
Devna, right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was only remembering her alias, her fake name. But you've got Trip and Devna, and kind of introducing that idea of freedom to her and what that would ultimately mean. And also this idea of truth. And truth, I think, plays a very big role in this novel. There's a lot of people trying to further their goals through deceit and that sort of thing. So in this story, the truth plays a really big role. And I think, without getting too much into the specifics of the plot, we're not getting really into spoilers yet, I don't think. To me, Trip and Maltuvis were kind of two sides of the same coin in this story. So their motivations are very different, obviously. Maltuvis is looking for world and possibly galactic domination at some point, and Trip wants to stop him. But they're both utilizing the same means in one way or another. They're using deceit and treachery and dishonesty to get what they want. I was wondering if you guys had kind of a comment on what that means, and maybe where Trip finds himself in this novel, and what role the truth could really play.
Yeah, I found that whole part really, really interesting, because it's true that Maltuvis has a different goal, and it's clear in his character, this is an evil guy and very different than who Trip is at his core, but Trip feels like he has to use deception. He's willing to assassinate people. He's willing to take the risk that a plan won't work and that lots of people will die from it. And he finds, so he's in this tough place where he feels like he's trying to do something in service of a greater good, but he has to keep justifying it to himself again and again and again. And he's kind of had to do that over the last, 12 years while he's been in Section 31. It's all been about deceit and, not telling people what's happened to him and trying to use underhanded means to achieve goals. So yeah, I felt that very much throughout this book, and that it was weighing very, very heavily on him.
I just kept seeing the parallels between him and Harris of Section 31. I felt that Trip is using the same logic and using deceit, as you're saying, to do what he feels needs to be done, which is right, and he would do whatever it takes to get there, whether it means people may lose their lives because of it, and it is like the needs of the many, so on and so forth. But I felt, Trip does start to realize that too, that he's acting just like Section 31, but he's going about what he's trying to accomplish versus what Section 31's trying to accomplish, but they're going about it in the same way. And so I don't think this is the Trip we knew 12 years earlier. This is a different Trip. And I think he's even questioning that too. Who is he? Is he even who he used to be? And who is he now? Because, just what I said, he's willing to sacrifice lives to get to the ultimate goal, if it means ultimate protection of the Federation.
And I'm, just saying that 12 years, it strikes me that, Trip has been undercover and with Section 31 longer than what we saw him in Enterprise for.
A lot longer.
Yeah. It's kind of striking to me that, that he's, and not wanting to get too much into spoilers yet, but he's self-aware enough to recognize this at one point, but he's so deep into it. And so, he doesn't initially really see what's going on and how damaging his actions seem to be, and it's kind of hard to read a little bit because it's, and I find this in a lot of books that I read in a lot of media. There's characters that, are making decisions and you just want to yell at them, no, don't do that. And, it feels like, it's very simple to not do what Trip is doing. But at the same time, in the story, he feels like he has no choice. And, I had no choice is kind of an oft repeated phrase that you get from people who, make terrible decisions. And Trip certainly does that, I think, in this book.
Yeah, I can hear Admiral Marcus in Into Darkness saying that same thing. There is no choice. If you want to survive, we have to do it this way. Don't be naive. And I almost feel like that's, what Trip is doing. He's like, I have to expose Section 31. I have to do certain things to get things right. And if that means sacrificing life and it means doing what's not right just to get to the ultimate end, then that's the right thing to do, and don't stop me. And even to the point that he feels that he has to portray the fact that he may, make people believe that he died so he can hide in the shadows. Well, that's what Section 31 does. They hide in the shadows and they operate from there. And he's becoming everything that he's against.
Yeah. Well, and I think that he's thinking that in order to take down something like Section 31, he has to use their methods, not realizing that there is another choice, that you could use something very different than their methods to still take them down. And yeah, it's kind of tough to read sometimes because you're like, no, does it really have to be this way? Do you have to be like them in order to take them down? Because the more that he's like them, I feel like the more he's getting entrenched in being a part of that or being what he's looking to destroy. He just becomes more of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the fight fire with fire.
Yeah.
That's what he's looking at.
And the ends justify the means, which, Justin, like you, or Bruce, like you mentioned, is something that Harris would probably shrug and go, yeah, you're right. And, they're operating on the same wavelength, and it's really scary to see for sure. And, really, it's an oft repeated lesson. It's almost a bit of a cliche, but it's a good lesson. You shine the truth on something and, it should wither away into the darkness and disappear, all you need to do is reveal the truth. And that's ultimately kind of what happens. I guess we should probably get into spoilers here now because we've been kind of dancing around what's going on in this book. So Those of you who are listening, we're going to be getting into spoilers now. So if you haven't read the book, what's wrong with you? Go buy it. Read it. It's good. Spoiler alert. I'm going to give this book a good rating at the end of the show. But so Trip, of course, is working to take down Section 31. We as Star Trek fans who have watched all of the shows and read a bunch of other novels know how that's ultimately going to go. But in this story, he's, kind of convinced that Harris is Section 31, kind of the be all and end all. He's at the top. It's his own private little army that he's constructed, and Trip is aiming to take them down. Now, I think it's kind of interesting. We get a bunch of dramatic irony here where we know a lot of things that the characters in the book don't know. And especially tying into David Mack's novel, Control, which came out earlier this year. It strikes me, we've gotten a lot of novels that are kind of dancing around the issue of Section 31 and dealing with them. So here again, we get, Crusaders trying to take down Section 31. What did you guys think of? Well, we've talked a little bit about what we think of Trip's methods. What do you think of Trip's, the plot that he's kind of undertaking to take down the section?
Plot that he's trying, it seems like he doesn't quite understand everything that's going on, so he's getting surprised at different points. And it seems like he's improvising and he's not quite... I mean, it seems like I think, something that's different than some of the other books where we've seen him working for Section 31, that he doesn't quite know what he's doing, that he's out of his depth, or that other people are playing him and he doesn't really know what's going on. So it just felt like throughout that he didn't really have much of a plan, except let me get to the end point of taking down Section 31. And if I have to do this now, okay, this happened, I have to do this now. Okay, this happened, I have to do this now. He is really going along, and ends justify the means, because he doesn't really know what his means are. He's just improvising it as he goes along to get to that end. So I felt like he was just kind of stumbling around, not knowing what he was doing, and just getting into it worse and worse. And people were, suffering and dying because of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's like he's zigzagging. It's, we're going in this direction. Oh, wait, maybe we need to change it this way or go that way. Yeah, I don't really feel like he had a plan that he felt confident in that was going to work. He was just kind of going through the motions and hoping to figure it out as he went along. But, and one thing I just want to comment on about Section 31 real quick is I definitely think it belongs in the story, because that's what these novels in the Rise of the Federation have been playing off of, especially with Trip. But I don't want... I'm starting to worry that Section 31 is going to be one of the big baddies of the Star Trek universe that we go to too much, the Klingons and the Romulans and the Borg, and now Section 31, and it's like, I don't want it to be overplayed too much. I think it's appropriate for this book and should continue with the Enterprise storyline, but I'm just starting to get a little weary about that.
I don't think it will continue actually in the Enterprise storyline, because I guess what I should say is it is strongly suggested that, Harris and this upper echelon of Section 31 destroy themselves, and that, they're discredited, although they're not called Section 31 in the press, and that they might go underground for a while. And there are some references, I think, in David Mack's book, Control, that every once in a while, Control feels like, they've gotten overexposed or things haven't gone well, so they just kind of clear it out and it lays low for a while. So I think it's actually going to lay low and maybe not even be in the Enterprise books. I mean, and also based on what happened in Control, it might not be in, the 24th century books either. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm with you, Bruce, that it's getting to the point where it's like, okay, I think this is good, but I think they are, at least my interpretation in, both centuries, 22nd and 24th, that they're kind of trying to phase it out and bring something else up.
No, I agree with that. And I also feel like this is kind of their retcon to say this is why you didn't really hear about Section 31 during TOS, because they're dormant. They're kind of laying low for now. We'll come back later. I don't feel like they needed to do that, but because for all we know, we see Section 31 at some point in Discovery, and there's a whole season about Section 31. I mean, there was rumors because the ship is the numbers, the NCC 1031. And I remember early on there were rumors like, ooh, is there a connection to Section 31? Because 31 is in the number of, the registry number of the ship, which of course that's actually 1031 for Halloween. Because Brian Fuller's a big Halloween guy.
At least in the U.S., that's what it means. But
yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think that's kind of one of the brilliant things about this particular aspect of Section 31 is that it can pop up when you need it. Because, and I mean, we're actually doing spoilers for Section 31 control here as well. I hope that's okay. But, Uriai, the computer the super intelligence that is control in Section 31, it can see and know almost anything that's going on throughout the Federation. So, for example, in this book, I think everything turned out exactly the way it wanted it to. And then, Harris and his group might think they decided to blow themselves up, but I think they were perfectly manipulated to do exactly what they needed to do and then taken care of. And I'm with you, Justin. It feels like Christopher Bennett is kind of closing the book on 31, at least in this era of the novels, because Trip is going off kind of underground still, but not associated with Section 31. And it really does feel like they're kind of being put on the shelf for now. But again, because of the nature of the group, if a good story comes along, and in Discovery, maybe you never know it, a good story might come along and it's able to just pop up and, recruit new agents and do its thing kind of thing. So,
well, Section 31, it's definitely going to be put on the shelf for a while in the Enterprise books, but for Trip's character, it's always going to have a huge impact in the books. It's always going to be referred to him as struggling through the way he is and what he did with Section 31 and so on and so forth. But the organization itself has been put aside for a while.
Yeah, but it's almost like it's become part of his DNA, how he does things. And yeah, it's definitely going to affect him. And I really wondered after I finished the book, like, what's Trip going to do now? I have no idea. I mean, they're going to do something. I mean, he's a major character and you want to see him do something. But that was one thing where I was like, I have no idea where this is going to go or what he's going to do. If Section 31's not around, I don't think he can go back into Starfleet. I mean, what's going to happen? I don't know.
No, that's interesting because, again, another spoiler to Brave the Storm, we see what he's doing about 20 years later after this. So we still have a gap to fill.
Well, not only that, but actually in Last Full Measure, you see what he's doing 70 years after this. So he's around for a long time, right. And he's doing something, but we don't know what. So it would be interesting to fill in the gaps. Yeah,
maybe he opens a catfish restaurant.
I like it.
Maybe.
But, yeah, it does feel like he will kind of need a redemption of some kind because, like you say, in To Brave the Storm, in the epilogue, we see that he's back with T'Pol.
On Vulcan, right?
On Vulcan, yeah. He's the gardener, I believe?
I think, or the handyman or something like that, yeah.
Something like that,
21. Yeah. It's in 2186, where this takes in 2166.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because he's... it's a difficult job for the writers because he's got to stay underground because history records that he died on the Enterprise in that wonderful episode, These Are the Voyages.
That I watched this morning.
I'm so sorry, Bruce. But, I think it's a tough job for the writers, but at the same time, it's an interesting challenge. And assuming that the Rise of the Federation series is going to go on and Trip is still going to be a character in them, I hope, because, he's a great character and we see him go off with Devna at the end here for, parts unknown. What's going to happen? Like you say, is there going to be some sort of redemption? What brings him from where he is to where he ends up? And I think that's a very interesting question that I'm really looking forward to seeing some answers to.
Yeah. I'll bet that somewhere in there he's in disguise and kind of seeing what's going on Earth and Vulcan. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, that is something where I'm like, oh, I want to read the next one and see where he's going to be.
And I like to see what happens with him and Devna. I mean, I'm not saying anything romantic, but that's a character. Her character, Devna the Orion, was someone who started to grow on me after a while. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to see a little more about her character in the next novel.
Yeah, I love that one line where Trip talks about seeing the emergence of the realization of what freedom is on her face. As he's like, doesn't it feel freeing to have no plan and nobody telling you what to do and everything's wide open in front of you? And she's kind of like, oh yeah, I love that, the description of that. That was, but it
really took
cool.
her a while to get there, which is interesting because he kept, hey, you have your freedom, and she kept saying, well, I don't really want my freedom. I don't think it's almost like she doesn't feel useful if she has freedom. She wanted to even refer to him as master, even though he wasn't her master, because she's just so used to that. It takes a while to really realize, how suppressed her life is. I don't think she really gets it.
Mm-hmm. But I think the final thing at the end there, where she does realize that she can be free, is that, they now have this cover story that they're both dead. And now, one of the, 3 sisters on Orion thinks she's dead and can't, well, actually, they do say that she thinks she's still alive, but Devna feels like she's free to do what she wants. And it seems like for the first time, she's just genuinely like relaxing and smiling, like, okay, what can we do with that? Mm-hmm. So that part will be really interesting to find out, knowing that someone actually has a suspicion that she's still around. So,
yeah. Well, I think she and Trip will probably work to take down the Orion Syndicate through deception and pinning them. Oh, God, I hope not. Come on, Trip, learn your lesson.
He's going to make the catfish. She's going to make the hush puppies.
I like it. I want to see this spinoff. Oh, man. That would be great. Well, one last thing I wanted to mention in this book. An important character we've actually not talked about is someone who's been there through all 4 years of Enterprise, a faithful companion who's been as much a part of the crew as anyone else, and that is our intrepid, peeing on sacred tree beagle, Porthos. And, he plays a surprising role in this novel, even though he's not front and center, he's only referred to, but he is Jonathan Archer's best friend in the world. And I really appreciated that this novel didn't shy away from showing that relationship between a person and his pet, and really giving it the kind of emotional weight that I think that relationship really deserves. I'm someone who, growing up, has always had a dog and, has been my companion on adventures and all that sort of stuff. And it really spoke to me as, a pet owner, that I love that there's an acknowledgement that relationship is important. And I love the role that it plays. And it was heartbreaking. It was honestly heartbreaking what Archer is going through in this novel, because Porthos is getting old, getting a little sickly. And by the end of the novel, we learn that Porthos is near death. And it has an effect, and it affects the plot of this novel, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, initially when you are first hearing about this, it's very interesting because you see Archer thinking like, there's all this Prime Directive stuff, but Porthos is the most important. I need to be there for Porthos. I mean, it's and anyone that's like ever felt really close to a pet can completely understand that. So I thought it was a really touching aspect and added something to the story. I mean, and also toward the end, Archer and Shran have been having this, big disagreement over the Prime Directive, and it seems like they're growing further and further apart. But then at the end, when Shran finds out that, Porthos is about to die, he says, okay, you need to be there for him. Don't worry about all of this argument. We'll work all of that out. You just need to be there for him, and I'd like to be there too. And Archer says, thanks, my friend. So they've kind of re-cemented their friendship through Archer has for Porthos, and that was really nice, and that felt like something real that could actually happen. And it added, it was just this little thing in the book, but it added a lot to me, and it felt like the perfect way to end things up.
It did. I agree. I love that scene, especially the fact that Archer is saying to Shran, hey, this is going on with Porthos, my dog, but of course we have more important things to do, and I can't just leave right now to deal with my dog. And Shran's like, no, you can, I'll stand behind you. We'll put things off. It can wait. You need to be with your dog. And it did show that closeness, that bond between these two. It shows that it's very strong, and it shows a lot of growth in the Shran character also. The only thing is this really breaks canon because, in Star Trek 09, Scotty did beam Archer's prize beagle Porthos, and that was in 2258. So he lived, a long 100-year life.
To be fair,
it couldn't be another beagle.
Yeah, all he says is Admiral Archer's prize beagle.
He doesn't say Porthos.
Doesn't say Porthos.
But did the novelization, I think, say Porthos? I don't know. Maybe not. I can't remember for sure.
It's got to be a different dog. Porthos 16.
Yeah.
Right.
And as much as I hate to say this, as someone who's an advocate for the novels and, literary Trek's co-host, non-canon.
Yes, of course. I know. I'm only teasing, but well, and real quick, I also wondered if maybe the prize beagle really was Porthos in the Star Trek movie, but he was, stuffed. He wasn't alive.
He's beaming a stuffed beagle?
Yeah, his prize beagle. He's had stuff sitting there in the corner all these years.
That's disturbing.
Got it. I never thought about it that way, that's for sure.
Wow. Okay. Well, on that note, why don't we go into kind of our final thoughts and ratings for Patterns of Interference? Bruce, what are your kind of final thoughts on this book?
Oh my gosh. I kind of have mixed feelings about this one. I feel like it's a really good book. I don't know if I like it quite as much as some of the previous ones that Christopher Bennett wrote, but I mean, it's close. It's really close. I don't know how to say this, but it did start to bother me in the beginning. I felt like there was too much sex going on. And I don't have a problem with sex. It's just there's, a scene with Cadet Kirk and Williams, and there's, actually, I felt the females in the book seemed to be very sexual. Williams, Val Williams is coming on to Cadet Kirk, and then we see, Paris coming on to Reed, and then we see, and it was just, and then
there was a
Ryan
lot of
Slide,
relationship stuff in this book, wasn't
lots of it, and it was a lot of like, sexual tension, of like wanting to jump bones and things like that. I mean, it was just, it really
Wait,
like
Bones is in this one?
Bones.
That's what I was thinking.
And Emery Dax too. No, but it was getting to a point that was almost taking me out of it. That I was like, okay, now I'm going to the next chapter. Are we going to see something else? Oh yeah, plants have sex, which is mentioned in chapter 5, and it just started taking me out of it. It seemed to slow down later. But that it was just starting to bother me a little. So because of that, I would say, I don't know how to do this now. I would give this book, okay, so I'm going to give this book 3 truths out of 5.
Ooh.
3.5 truths out of 5.
Still a very good rating. Absolutely. Justin, what are your thoughts on the book and or anything Bruce has talked about?
Yeah, I mean, so, we've talked about some different aspects of the book that I really enjoyed a lot. The Prime Directive discussions were great. The part with the plants and their culture and all of that was really fascinating. There were all these questions of freedom and truth and the methods that people use to take power. And there was just a lot of good stuff that was going on. But at the same time, I did have, a bit of mixed feelings like Bruce did. It did seem like there was a lot of relationship stuff, and there was, sex referred to, or that was there that kind of took away from it. I mean, again, I feel the same way as Bruce. I don't have any problem with that, but it felt like it was taking a bit away from the story sometimes, and just taking me out of it a little bit. And there were also, some parts where, it was referring to things that were in control or 24th century that took me out of it a bit. So, I felt like there was a lot of good stuff that was here. But some of the things that there was emphasis on took maybe a little bit away from what could have been there. And another thing that I wanted to mention is this guy Maltuvis. He's way, way, way over the top. Like, there's these parts where you're getting into his thoughts, and he's like the most narcissistic person in the universe or that you could ever imagine. And it was a little bit too much. It's like, okay, I know that he's evil, but I mean, overall, like, if I think about the book as a whole, there's a lot of great stuff. I really enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to the next book to see some of these things move forward. And I'd give it 8 out of 10 Section 31 takedowns.
Very nice. Yeah, I think I would have to agree with a lot of what both of you have said. There is an awful lot of sex in this book. And, when it got to that part where it talks about, well, if there's no insects, how do the plants pollinate each other? It's like, well, they eliminate that need because they can move. And at that point, I'm like, oh no. And then the character says, you mean the plants have sex? And I'm like, oh man, even the plants have sex in this book. And it's not even just via bee or butterfly. They actually go and have sex. I mean,
well, and let's be clear. We keep saying this, but there's no sex scenes. There's no graphic sex. Yeah. It's just mentioned.
It's just heavily implied.
That's true. Yeah. It's heavily referred to.
But I mean, there are also some times where, like, whenever you have Orions in a book, I mean, I guess it's going to happen. But like, they've got this really bad news about what's happened to Maltuvis, who they're supporting. And they're like, oh no, what are we going to do? Oh, let's go to a male orgy. And it's like, is that really necessary to put in the book? Like, I don't know. I mean, it just seemed like it was just like unnecessarily so,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my one eye roll moment, because I could hear the tone of voice.
They're Ryans. Of course, that's what they would do. That's what they would all do,
Yeah, and you can hear the tone of voice that Christopher Bennett's even going for. It's like, oh, what should we do? All male orgy? Okay, it's just like, oh, okay, like, yeah. So there were those bits like you said brought me out of the novel. But I do really appreciate the Prime Directive debate for sure. And also the Strange New World aspect of it with this culture, like you mentioned, Justin, is just a lot of fun. And wondering what's going to happen next, where this story is going from here, what Trip is going to be doing. The one thing that I had a bit of a problem with was, so many times Trip had to be so blind to some of the stuff that's going on, and his plan was so convoluted and complicated. Just a few times it was a little bit too much. But I do like where that story takes his character. So I'm kind of more willing to forgive that because of the journey that his character takes and the realizations he comes to. So I think I would have to give this one, I would say 4 out of 5 stuffed Porthoses.
Oh, poor Porthos.
Ending it on that note. Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, Justin, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Patterns of Interference. I really like the dynamic of having 3 people on, and to finally be able to get you on the show. We've wanted to have you for a while, and it's great to have you on board for this episode.
Oh, it was so much fun being here. I love Star Trek books and comics. It was just a pleasure to talk about, a new book that's just come out that I hope everybody will check out. Just so great being here for my first time on Literary Treks.
Well, you'll have to be in our back pocket as one of our ringers when we can't get the author, for example, or just any other time that we have an empty slot that we want to fill, because we really enjoyed this discussion for sure.
Oh, thank you. I'd be happy to be here anytime.
Yes, I already have him in a future slot.
Excellent.
He does, yeah.
Well, until then, where can we find you on the interwebs?
Well, you can find me elsewhere on the network, where I co-host Earl Grey, our dedicated TNG podcast with Amy Nelson and Richard Marquez. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm at TrekFan4747, where I tweet about nothing but Star Trek. And I'm currently tweeting out my Season 3 TNG rewatch. You can also find me hanging around the Babel Conference on Facebook. And because I'm on Literary Treks, I just wanted to mention that I do participate in some Facebook Star Trek books groups, the Star Trek books discussion group, the books community group, and then literally Star Trek, which I had found recently. So you may see me there reviewing, the latest book that I've read, or participating there. So there's a lot of different places you can find me.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned earlier that you thought that we had probably read more Star Trek books than you have. Judging by the number of books you're posting about on those groups, I think you might be wrong about that.
Either that or you're getting close to catching up and surpassing us.
I see. Yeah, that I don't know, because what I didn't mention before is that I read my first Star Trek book just a little over 3 years ago, when I first finished Deep Space Nine, since I've more recently become a Star Trek fan, and I wanted to read the DS9 relaunch. And since then, I've read a book about every week or 10 days. So I'm up to almost 135 with this book. How does that compare with you guys?
Probably getting close-ish. I'm not sure myself, actually.
What, you don't have a spreadsheet to keep track of these things like I do?
Oh gosh, no.
I do since a certain year. But as far as my youth spent reading them before that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, same here. But I did do a count a couple years ago, and I was about at 300, so I know I'm over 300. I just don't know how far over.
So you're beyond me. And a lot of the ones that I have read have been relaunch books. So I haven't read nearly as many that take place during the series. So I'm trying to catch up.
I'm sure you'll catch us soon at the rate you're going. So awesome.
Well, it is my it is my goal to read everything in Star Trek fiction at some point. And I got the Voyages of the Imagination book recently to help with that quest. But I think by my estimate, I probably have at least about 600 or 700 more. So it's gonna still take some years to get there.
Plus adding a new one every month.
Well, yeah, there's keeping up with that as well. So in order to keep up, I need to read more than one other book every month also.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay, thanks so much.
I'm just so glad that Justin finally got on the show. Yes, he has been badgering me, but, he didn't have to badger at all. I always planned to have him on at some point anyway.
Sure you didn't know. Yeah, no, it was really great to have him on. Always a fun discussion. And like I say, I really like that dynamic of three people. And Justin is he's someone who's reading a lot of Star Trek novels and brings a really interesting perspective to the show.
Yes, and I mean, again, he's on Earl Grey. I enjoy listening to him on there, and I got to hang out with him at Star Trek Las Vegas, so that was fun too.
Awesome. Well, it's been really fun talking about the rise of the Federation with you and Justin today, but it's not the only thing that we've been discussing on the Trek.fm network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, the 602 Club.
I honestly was thrilled with the way that they set it up because, like you said, sort of like Russian dolls, I guess, is a good way to explain it. You introduce one character in this existing show, and then it leads to that character's own show, which leads to the next one's own show.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
There were a lot of comments talking about this roller coaster ride. Mm-hmm. Yay, I'm so excited Trek's on. Oh, it's a prequel. I saw the first trailer and I loved it. Oh, Brian Fuller's no longer working on it. Mm-hmm. Oh, we're getting all this diversity. Oh, look at the Klingons, right? And you could just see it. Seriously, some fans have gone through some serious roller coaster rides.
To the journey!
And so I could see the Hirogen viewing themselves as very noble, very civilized. They don't let their prey suffer, but really they're doing these horrific things, just like we do here in the real world when we have to go fight wars.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they go home and they write an epic poem about it, and that makes it okay.
the Hirogen equivalent of Beowulf, right?
Warp 5.
Gary Graham came over and said a couple of nice things, but the funny thing was he said, I've been on this show for 4 years. This is my first day on the bridge. You're over there firing the phasers? What is going on?
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you eat apples, that's a healthy alternative to other snacky foods. But if you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. And if you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and most third-party apps. And you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
If you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm to get all of the details. Perks can include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, stuffed Porthos sitting in the corner, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. I don't think you can actually get that last one, though. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, and we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all of the details at patreon.com/trekfm.
So, I think we'd really love to hear your thoughts on today's show. And there's many ways you can do that. So the best place is to join in on the larger conversation, and that's in the Babel Conference. It's our listeners group on Facebook. So if you have Facebook, go to it now and type in Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field, and it should come right up. And if you'd like to send us an email, well, guess what? You can do that too. You can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Literary Treks, and that will come right to us, and you can find the network also on Twitter and Facebook. So on Twitter, go to @TrekFM, and on Facebook, go to facebook.com/TrekFM.
Well, special for Literary Treks, we're not just on Facebook and Twitter. You can also find us on Goodreads, and there you'll find bookshelves with all of our previously covered books, as well as a currently reading section, so you can check that out and know what's coming up for future shows. And in addition, there are also great conversations happening about all of the books and comics that make up the Star Trek literary universe. Just search for Literary Treks on Goodreads and click Join Group. We'd also like to thank our producers, our associate producers, Ken Tripp, Greg Rosier, and Brandon Shea Mutala, for their support of the Trek FM network, and specifically for being associate producers for Literary Treks. Now, Bruce, when you're not setting out for parts unknown under an assumed name with the wind at your back and nothing in your future, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Admiral_Rex, and you can find me on Star Wars Report podcast talking about Star Wars with Riley Blanton and Mark Hurleman. Go to StarWarsReport.com for that. And you can also find a panel I did at DragonCon talking about Star Wars books, and that's on one of the supplementals that recently came out on the 602 Club, so check that out. So Dan, when you aren't trying to take down Section 31 and running around with the Orion slave girl, where can people find you?
#Harris sucks. You can find me on Twitter at Kurtrats, that's Kertrats. You can find me on youtube.com/KurtratsProductions, facebook.com/KurtratsProductions, Instagram at Kurtrats47, and of course in the Babel Conference talking about Star Trek. Well, thank you all so much for listening, and until next time,
live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.